When Deputy Earl Conroy put handcuffs on Walter Danner at the end of my dock, 50 people from Blue Heron Landing went so still I could hear the ice melting in their piver cups. A minute earlier, Walter had been waving a clipboard over my head and telling everybody the lake behind my cottage belonged to the whole community. I stood there barefoot in my kitchen apron with a county plat in one hand and my little RCA camcorder in the other, thinking, well, Walter, you finally picked a fight with a woman who keeps every receipt. That was September of 1995. The kind of warm Ohio afternoon when the sun sits low over the water and makes everybody think they have more time than they really do. But the beginning of the story was much quieter than that. It started with a little grey cottage at the end of Juniper Lane, a dock that leaned slightly to the left, and me, Evelyn Mercer, 53 years old, recently divorced, tired in ways I did not know how to explain to anyone without sounding ungrateful. I had spent most of my adult life making room for other people. I made room for my husband when he came home angry from work. I made room for my sons when they were teenagers and thought every problem in the world could be fixed with a car ride and a cheeseburger. I made room for my mother when she got sick, and by the time I finally signed the divorce papers, I realized something sad and simple. I had spent 27 years living in houses that never really felt like mine. So when I found that cottage at Blue Heron Landing, 15 miles outside a little town called Fairmont, I bought it with every dollar I had left from the sale of my old house. It was not fancy. The kitchen cabinets were yellow, the carpet smelled faintly like somebody else's dog, and the bathroom door only shut if you lifted it an inch before turning the knob. That there was a screened porch, an old stone fireplace, and a private dock that stretched out over the lake like a crooked finger pointing toward peace. That dock mattered to me more than I knew at the time. My father had loved fishing, and when I was a girl, he used to take me to Lake Erie before sunrise. He would pack thermos coffee, ham sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, and one of those little metal tackle boxes that sounded like a toolbox every time he opened it. He never caught much, but he always said the point was not the fish. The point was sitting somewhere quiet long enough to remember who you were. After the divorce, that sounded like religion to me. The first few weeks at Blue Heron Landing were exactly what I had hoped for. I went to work at the county records office during the week, came home around 5:30, changed into an old sweatshirt, and sat at the end of that dock with my feet over the water. Sometimes I read paperback mysteries. Sometimes I listened to the Indians' game on a little radio. Sometimes I just watched the light disappear over the lake and felt my shoulders come down from around my ears. Then one Saturday morning, I heard laughing outside my bedroom window. At first I thought it was a couple of kids walking along the shore, but when I looked through the curtain, I saw 3 teenage boys sitting on my dock with their sneakers off, throwing rocks into the water and drinking orange soda. One of them had a fishing pole propped against my railing like he paid taxes there. I walked outside in my robe, still holding a mug of coffee, and said, "Boys, can I help you with something?" The tallest one looked up at me and smiled like he was being charming. Mr. Danner said everybody could use the dock. I remember blinking at him because I honestly thought I had misheard. Everybody can use what dock? He pointed down at the boards under his feet and said, "This one. The lady who lived here before you never minded." Now, I had heard about Walter Danner before I ever moved in. Everybody at Blue Heron Landing knew Walter. He was chairman of the Lake Association, which sounded important until you saw the office, a folding table in the back room of the community hall next to a stack of bingo supplies. Walter was 58, broad in the middle, silver-haired, always wearing boat shoes, even in February. And he had the habit of talking to people like he was doing them a favor by allowing them to stand near him. He sold insurance for 20 years before he retired, and he carried a clipboard everywhere, even to cookouts, which told you about all you needed to know. I told the boys they needed to leave, and to their credit, they did. They were embarrassed, and I could see they had just believed what they had been told. 10 minutes later, Walter himself came walking down my gravel drive carrying that clipboard under one arm and a smile that never reached his eyes. He said, "Evie, I heard there was a little confusion." I said, "There is. People are sitting on my dock." He laughed softly, the way a man laughs when he thinks a woman has said something cute without meaning to. Then he said, "Old Mr. Harlan let folks fish there for years. It is kind of a Blue Heron tradition." I told him Mr. Harlan had sold me the property, not a membership in a fishing club. Walter leaned closer and said, "Now come on, honey. We are all neighbors here." And that word, honey, did something to me. It took me right back to my old kitchen, standing across from my ex-husband, while he explained why I was being too sensitive about something that had clearly hurt me. I smiled because smiling had always been my first defense, and I said, "Walter, neighbors ask before they walk onto somebody else's property." He looked at me for a long moment, then gave a little shrug. "Fine," he said, "I will straighten it out." But he did not straighten it out. He tested it. A few days later, I came home and found 2 folding chairs on my dock, an empty beer can in the grass, and a red and white bobber floating near the shore. I put a small chain across the path from the road to the dock and hung a plain sign that said, "Private Property." The next morning, the sign was lying in the weeds. 3 days after that, I got my first letter from the Lake Association. It was typed on paper with a little blue heron logo at the top, and it accused me of creating an unfriendly atmosphere by obstructing community shoreline access. I read it at my kitchen table 3 times. Then I laughed so hard I scared my cat. I did not even have a cat. The letter made no sense, but what bothered me was that Walter knew it made no sense. He was counting on me not knowing the rules. He was counting on me being tired. He was counting on me being the kind of woman who would pay a $50 fine just to avoid a conversation. For the first time in a long time, I decided not to make room. The middle of this story is where I stopped trying to be agreeable and started paying attention. I bought a spiral notebook from the drugstore and began writing things down. Dates, times, names, license plates, empty cans, footprints, every little thing. I took Polaroids when I saw strangers on the dock. I borrowed my brother's old RCA VHS-C camcorder and set it on the porch when I was away. It was big and awkward and made a faint tucking sound before it started recording, but in 1995, that little machine became my best friend. I also went to work one morning and did something Walter never expected me to do. I pulled the original county plat for Blue Heron Landing. The property records office was not glamorous, believe me. It smelled like dust, copier toner, and the burned coffee Mrs. Wallace made every morning at 9. But those records told stories. They told you who owned what, where roads ended, where easements began, and which confident man with a clipboard had been making things up for 20 years. I found the original subdivision map from 1958. There was a narrow public footpath along the south side of the lake, but it ended almost 80 yards away from my dock. My dock, the shoreline behind my cottage, and the little boat ramp beside it were all inside my property line. There was no shared access, no community right, no gray area, just paper, ink, measurements, and the truth. I made certified copies. I paid $8.50 for them, and I kept the receipt. Then I called my older son, Danny, who lived in Dayton and had the habit of sounding like he was still 12 whenever he said Mom. I told him what was happening, and he got quiet for a second. Then he said, "Mom, those people are not confused. They are betting you will get uncomfortable before they do." That stayed with me. Around that same time, an older woman named Hattie Sloan came by my house with a peach pie and a story. Hattie lived 2 houses down, had been a librarian for 35 years, and could smell nonsense from half a mile away. She sat at my kitchen table, drank iced tea, and said, "Walter has wanted that dock for years. Mr. Harlan let people use it because he was lonely after his wife died. Walter turned kindness into a habit, and then he turned the habit into a right." Hattie told me Walter had been losing control of the Lake Association for months. The common beach had been closed after heavy flooding the year before, and the board was under pressure because families were angry. They were paying dues for a lake community with no usable gathering spot. Walter needed a place for the annual Labor Day picnic. He wanted my dock because it looked good in photographs, because it sat on the prettiest stretch of shoreline, and because if he could make everyone believe it belonged to the community, he could keep calling himself the man who held Blue Heron Landing together. Suddenly, everything made sense. It was never about fishing. It was never about kids needing a place to swim. Walter wanted the dock because he needed people to believe he still had power. He was not defending community. He was defending his own little throne. A week later, I got another association notice, this one accusing me of creating a safety hazard by locking the path to my own dock. I went to the monthly meeting at the community hall, and I will never forget the way Walter looked when I walked in carrying a manila folder. He had expected me to stay home and mail in a check. The room was full of neighbors, most of them decent people who did not enjoy conflict and had spent years letting Walter talk louder than everyone else. Walter stood at the front in a blue polo shirt, holding a stack of papers like he was about to announce a national emergency. He said, "We've received complaints about restricted waterfront access at 4 Juniper Lane." I stood up and said, "You mean my waterfront access?" The room got quiet. Walter smiled and said, "Evie, this is not personal." That was how he always started, when he was about to make something deeply personal. I walked to the front table and placed the certified plat in front of him. I said, "This is the original county map. The public footpath ends over there. My property begins here. My dock is here. You are standing at this table telling people they have rights that do not exist." Walter did not look at the map. Not once. He just said, "We have always used that area." I said, "People used it because Mr. Harnan allowed it. Permission is not ownership, Walter." Then he got that look in his eyes, the look of a man who realizes the room might finally be seeing him clearly. He said, "You moved here and decided you were better than the people who built this place." I leaned closer and I said, "No, Walter. I moved here because I thought grown people understood the difference between being welcome and being entitled." A few people laughed, softly at first, then louder. Walter slammed his clipboard down on the table. He told the board he would investigate further. I knew what that meant. It meant he would be angry in private and polite in public until he found another way to push me. Sure enough, 2 days later, every mailbox in Blue Heron Landing received a flyer printed on association letterhead. Labor Day Lake Supper, Saturday at 4 Juniper Lane. Community food, music, games for the kids, and lake access for all residents. I held that flyer in my kitchen and felt something cold move through my chest. It was not fear exactly, it was clarity. Walter had made his choice. He was not asking anymore. He was daring me to stop him. I called Deputy Earl Conroy that afternoon. Earl was a broad-shouldered man with a tired face and a soft voice, the kind of officer who had probably settled more arguments about fence lines and barking dogs than he cared to remember. I told him what had been happening. I told him about the letters, the dock, the footage, the flyer. He said, "Mrs. Mercer, if people come onto your property after you tell them not to, call us. Do not argue, do not touch anybody, and do not try to handle it alone." I said I have no intention of handling it alone. I had already learned that the hard way. The end came on Labor Day weekend. I woke up before sunrise, made coffee, and sat by the kitchen window with the camcorder beside me. Around 10:30, I saw Walter's beige Buick pull up near the path. Behind him came pickup trucks, minivans, coolers, lawn chairs, folding tables, even a man carrying a crock pot wrapped in a bath towel. Walter got out wearing a red polo shirt and white boat shoes. He had a bullhorn under his arm. I watched him walk to my chain, take out a pair of bolt cutters and snap the lock clean in half. Then he waved everybody through. For a moment I did nothing. I just sat there and watched people I had known for months walk across my yard, not because they were cruel, but because Walter had told them it was all right. That was the saddest part. Most of them were good people. They brought potato salad and folding chairs because they thought they were coming to a neighborhood picnic. They did not know they were walking into somebody else's boundary. Then I pressed record. I filmed Walter unloading food, setting up a banner, directing kids toward the dock, and telling people to leave their cars near my driveway. I filmed him standing at the end of my dock with that bullhorn saying, "This is what community looks like." I remember thinking, "No, Walter, this is what control looks like when it brings a casserole." By noon, there were nearly 50 people in my yard. Children were running along the shore. Somebody had started a country music tape on a boombox, and Walter was collecting money in a coffee can labeled Lake Improvements. That was when I called Earl. He arrived about 15 minutes later with another deputy. The music stopped the second people saw the cruiser. Walter walked toward them with that same calm smile, the smile he used whenever he thought he could talk his way out of something. He said, "Officer, glad you are here. We are having a community gathering." Mrs. Mercer seems upset. Earl looked past him at the chain lying in the dirt, then at the people standing on my lawn, then at me. I walked out, carrying the county plat in the camcorder. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady. I said, "Deputy, this is my property. I have told Mr. Dada that several times. I have the deed, the county plat, and video of him cutting my lock and inviting people in." Walter said, "That dock has always been shared." Earl said, "Mr. Dana, shared by whom?" Walter pointed at the crowd and said, "By all of us." Earl looked at the plat for maybe 20 seconds. Then he handed it to the other deputy and said, "This access path ends before her property line." He turned back to Walter. "Mr. Dana, you need to have everyone leave." Walter's face changed. It happened slowly, but I saw it. The smile went first, then the color in his cheeks, then that little gleam he always had when he thought he was the smartest man in the room. He said, "You are taking her word over mine." Earl said, "I am taking the county records over yours." Walter stepped toward me and said, "You planned this. You wanted to embarrass me." I looked him right in the eye and said, "No, Walter. I wanted you to stop. You just kept giving me reasons to document it." That was when he reached for the camcorder. He grabbed it so fast I bet he had time to pull back. The strap snapped against my wrist, the camera hit the ground, and Earl moved between us before I could say a word. Walter kept shouting, saying I had set him up, saying the association would ruin me, saying I had poisoned the whole neighborhood against him. Earl told him to put his hands behind his back. Walter laughed at first like he thought it was a joke. Then the cuffs clicked. I will never forget that sound. It was not dramatic like on television. It was small, metallic, almost ordinary. But to me it sounded like a door closing on something that had been open far too long. People started gathering their things. A few apologized as they walked past me. Some could not meet my eyes. Hattie came over with her pie dish still in her hands and whispered, "Well, honey, I guess the lake finally got a little quieter." I laughed, and then I cried, which was inconvenient because I was still wearing my old apron and had one bare foot covered in grass clippings. But I cried anyway. Not because Walter got arrested. Not really. I cried because I had spent so many years believing that keeping the peace meant letting people take pieces of me. The next few weeks were strange. Walter was charged with trespassing and property damage, and the association board suddenly became very interested in paperwork. It turned out the Labor Day flyer had been printed with association money without a vote. The coffee can donations were never reported. The board found receipts for banners, signs, and rental equipment that Walter had approved himself. It was not some grand criminal empire. It was smaller than that, sadder than that. It was a man using a little bit of power to make himself feel bigger than he was. Walter resigned before the next meeting. His wife moved in with her sister for a while. The Lake Association withdrew every notice they had sent me and mailed me an apology that looked like it had been written by 3 people trying not to blame one another. I framed the apology and put it in the bathroom because sometimes a woman deserves to laugh while brushing her teeth. But the real ending came a few months later, on a cold Sunday in November. I was standing on my dock in a wool coat holding a cup of coffee when I heard voices behind me. I turned around and saw Hattie, her husband Frank, the kids from 2 houses down, and a few neighbors carrying fishing poles and a bag of donuts. Hattie smiled and said, "We came to ask." I looked at her for a second, then I smiled. "You asked. That is the whole difference." So I let them come down to the dock. We drank coffee, the kids fished. Frank told the same story about catching a 30-pound bass in 1978, and nobody believed him, including Frank. The lake was cold and grey, the sky was low, and for the first time since I moved there, Blue Heron Landing felt like a community instead of a courtroom. I put up a new sign at the entrance to my path a few days later. It did not say, "Keep out." It did not say, "Trespassers will be prosecuted." It simply said, "Private dock. Guests welcome. By invitation." Some people told me I should have been more forgiving with Walter. A few said I embarrassed him, that I could have handled it quietly, that maybe he had just gotten carried away trying to hold the neighborhood together. Maybe they were right. Maybe a man can be lonely and wrong at the same time. Maybe a woman can protect herself and still feel sorry for the person who made it necessary. But I know this much. Community is not taking what somebody else has because you think you deserve it. Community is asking. Community is hearing no without turning it into a war. And peace is not something you find by the water. Peace is something you build when you finally decide your boundaries are worth defending. Did I go too far by calling the deputy and letting Walter face the consequences? Or did Walter get exactly what he earned when he tried to turn my home into his private campaign stage? Put your answer in the comments. Share your own story if you've ever dealt with someone who confused control with community. And subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who finally decided they were done being pushed aside.